When we talk about slavery, most people picture cotton fields, chains, and cruel white overseers. We hear about the suffering of black women, about the violence and abuse from white men. But there's a part of that story that's almost never told: the abuse of black male slaves by white women. In the antebellum South, white women were seen as gentle, innocent, even powerless. But behind closed doors, many of them held more control than most people realize, and some used that control in the most sinister ways. They forced black men to reproduce. They committed sexual abuse. They controlled through threats, manipulation, and silence. This chapter of history has been ignored for too long. What you're about to hear is drawn from real testimony, legal records, and the words of those who lived it. They are pieces of a suppressed truth that demand to be brought into the light. This video is part 3 in our series. If you've been watching our channel, you know we don't shy away from hard history, so be sure to check out our previous videos where we discuss other notable examples and historical accounts on this topic. Give this video a like to show your support for stories that deserve to be heard, and let's begin. The most dangerous place for an enslaved black man wasn't always the field. Sometimes it was the quiet corner of a house, a narrow staircase, or a bedchamber where a white woman waited in silence. Many times these encounters left no scars on the outside, but it carved deep wounds all the same. Black men lived under the constant threat of sexual coercion by the very women Southern society claimed were in need of protection. These were the daughters, wives, and widows of plantation owners, women who had grown up being told they were morally superior, modest, and socially delicate. But within slavery's twisted logic, they held life or death control over the people in their homes. Some used that control to dominate through forced intimacy. In one documented case from early 19th century Virginia, a man named David found himself trapped in exactly this situation. He was a black man in bondage who dared to refuse a white woman. That refusal almost cost him his life. The woman's name was Dolly Getz. She was unmarried and living in a household where David worked as a slave. At some point, according to sworn testimony and community petitions, Dolly initiated a sexual relationship with David. It became a sustained affair that lasted at least 3 years. People around them noticed. Neighbors testified that they were frequently found in bed together under her father's roof, with her own family reportedly aware of the situation. At the time, interracial sex between a black man and a white woman was not only scandalous, but considered criminal. The racial and sexual codes of antebellum Virginia made such a relationship taboo in every direction. But Dolly was undeterred. She reportedly pressured David repeatedly to run away with her, but David refused. He understood what was at stake. He knew that crossing state lines with a white woman, especially as a black man, could mean immediate suspicion, capture, or worse. Eventually, David decided to distance himself from her entirely, and that's when everything turned. After he rejected her, Dolly accused him of rape. It was a charge that needed no evidence, no corroboration, just her word against his. David was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. A black man in bondage, condemned to die for allegedly violating a white woman who had pursued him relentlessly. Fortunately, community members saw through the case. A petition to the governor circulated, signed by people who knew both parties. They testified not only that the relationship had been ongoing, but that it had been instigated by Dolly herself. She had invited David into her bed. She had asked him to run away. Her improper conduct was well known in the area. Even Dolly admitted under oath that their relationship arose from her persuasions. Despite this overwhelming evidence, the legal system did what it always did. It bent to protect whiteness and punish blackness. David's conviction stood. Dolly, in contrast, was sentenced only to a public whipping. Embarrassment, pain, yes, but she lived while David was still executed, his life taken by a system that refused to hold white women accountable. The outcome speaks volumes about the racial and sexual power dynamics of the era. A white woman could pursue a black man, initiate sex, and even attempt to elope with him. But if he refused her or tried to sever ties, she had the power to reverse the entire story and cast herself as the victim. Society would believe her, the courts would act on it, and the black man, whether guilty or not, could be executed simply for being implicated. Another especially revealing case comes from Kentucky in the early 1840s. There, a white woman entered into a long-term relationship with an enslaved black man named James. They lived together as though they were a couple, sharing not just a household, but also the trappings of emotional intimacy. But under slavery, what looked like partnership was anything but equal. James was legally her property. Court records from Mercer County, Kentucky, unearthed in the late 20th century by historian Martha Hodes, document how this woman, while appearing to care for James, used the full weight of her authority when it suited her. Witnesses recalled that she frequently warned James, "I'll send you down the river," whenever she was angry or dissatisfied. The threat was unmistakable. Being sold down the river referred to a sail into the deep south, usually to Mississippi or Louisiana, where the cotton economy was booming and labor conditions were far more severe. For an enslaved person, this meant backbreaking work, separation from family, and a sharply reduced chance of survival. Even while living with the mistress and likely fulfilling the duties of both laborer and lover, James had no real power. Her affection was conditional, her threats real. Any moment of disobedience could be met with punishment that was final and absolute. One argument, one refusal, one misstep, and she could sell him as easily as she would a mule. Now, what makes James's case especially notable is that it emerged through court testimony during a legal dispute over the woman's estate after her death. The relationship, once private, became public and deeply scrutinized. Neighbors and local officials acknowledged their unusual living arrangement, referring to James in some documents not as a slave, but as her concubine. But no matter what they called it, the law never recognized him as a man with rights. He was still property, and she, despite flouting every social and moral code of the time, remained in control until the end. This case is one of the few from the antebellum period where such an intimate relationship between a white woman and an enslaved black man is recorded with some clarity. Martha Hodes, in her book, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South, highlights this Kentucky case as part of a broader, hidden pattern in the antebellum South, one where white women could initiate sexual and emotional relationships with enslaved black men, only to fall back on the violent powers of ownership whenever those men displeased them or refused to comply. In the South, such stories were not usually discussed in public. Why? Because the very idea that a white woman could abuse a black man sexually or emotionally clashed with the myths the region told about itself. The myth of the innocent Southern belle, the myth of the dangerous black male predator. These lies created a smokescreen that allowed white women to act with impunity. If discovered, they could feign innocence, claim coercion, or simply deny everything. The law would take their word over any black man's. But some women didn't even need to hide what they were doing. In certain cases, a white woman might assign an enslaved man to herself. It didn't have to be stated aloud. A glance, a summons, or a whispered order was enough. And the man, knowing what refusal meant, complied. These abuses weren't always acts of lust. Sometimes they were about power. White women, denied agency in other areas of Southern life, found it here, in the absolute control they had over the enslaved men under their roof. In the interviews collected by the Federal Writers Project during the 1930s, formerly enslaved men described how white mistresses controlled them, not only through violence, but through humiliation and fear. One man recalled how the woman he served would punish his refusals, not with beatings, but by singling him out during chores, mocking him in front of others, and threatening to sell his wife. The threat of losing one's family, dignity, or even sense of self was weaponized to guarantee obedience. And the worst part of this violence was that it often left no visible mark to others. A scar from a whip could be seen and acknowledged, but the scars left by sexual abuse at the hands of white women were hidden. There were no courts for justice, no safe place to speak. If a black man even hinted at what had happened, he could be lynched. And so, they carried it in silence. Generations of men, fathers, sons, brothers, lived and died with these traumas unspoken. The myth of the Southern lady endured, but the truth, hidden behind lace curtains and locked bedroom doors, was far more disturbing. Some white women not only initiated abuse, but also forced enslaved black men to make children for profit. The word breeding is usually reserved for livestock, but on plantations across the American South, it was also used to describe what happened to human beings. Slavery didn't just take work from black bodies, it took their bloodlines. Every child born in captivity meant more money for the enslaver, and many white women were directly involved in making sure their enslaved labor force kept growing. This practice turned the most intimate part of a person's life into a calculation. It happened in back rooms and barns, behind the polite fronts of grand houses. And for enslaved black men, being chosen to breed meant losing control over the most basic parts of manhood: who they loved, who they lay with, and who their children would become. One enslaved man named Paul gave a chilling account of how a white mistress attempted to control not just his labor, but his most personal relationships. She told him to marry a girl named Sally, who was only 13 years old. Paul didn't love Sally. He didn't want to be part of what he clearly saw as a forced union. And so, he spoke up. He protested. That was when he realized the mistress hadn't made a request. She had given an order. When Paul continued to resist, the mistress moved on. She selected another man, Abram, and ordered Sally to marry him instead. Paul later recalled that Abram and Sally eventually got along. They were lucky that they happened to get along. But luck is not freedom. Neither had been consulted. There was no ceremony of love, no space for consent. The pairing was dictated by the woman who owned them both, and her interest was not in their happiness. It was in creating more children who would be born into bondage and grow up to work her land. After the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1808, enslavers had to rely on birth rates to grow their fortunes. Every child born into slavery became property. That meant the bodies of both women and men were tools. And if a plantation lacked enough children, someone made sure that changed. And many times, a white woman was actually behind the decision. One particularly harrowing example is the story of Luke, an enslaved man in Alabama whose body was valued not for who he was, but for what he could produce. Described as tall, broad-shouldered, and immensely strong, Luke was singled out by his enslavers in the mid-1800s for a specific purpose: not to labor in the fields like most men his age, but to breed. By the 1850s, it was said that Luke had fathered more than 50 children, none by choice. His strength made him an asset. His reproductive capacity made him profitable. White enslavers, understanding that each new birth meant more wealth, treated Luke as a human stud. They kept him well-fed, sheltered, and exempt from the harshest physical labor, not out of kindness, but because his body was too valuable to damage. Their goal was to keep him in peak condition so they could use him again and again. Luke was not allowed to form lasting attachments. He was not permitted to choose a partner. When a woman on the plantation, or on a neighboring one, was considered of childbearing age, Luke might be sent to her, often under orders from a white mistress managing the estate. These visits weren't romantic. They were arrangements, enforced through expectation and power. Luke didn't go willingly. He went because he was told. The women, too, had no say. Two human beings forced into an intimate act, while white overseers and their mistresses tracked the outcomes like inventory. What happened to the children Luke fathered? Many were sold off as soon as they were old enough to work. Others remained on the plantation, knowing little or nothing about who their father was or how they came to be. Luke likely watched as his sons and daughters were separated, carted away in chains, or beaten into submission like everyone else. He had no power to protect them, no control over what kind of life they would live. The act of fatherhood was stripped of meaning. It became an obligation enforced through domination. Luke's story survived through oral histories passed down by his descendants. They remembered the way he was used and the silence he carried. He was said to be a quiet man, withdrawn, as if burdened by something that could never be spoken aloud. And how could he not be? He had been denied the most basic human right, to choose who to love and how to live. Outside the United States, the grim practice of forced breeding of black male slaves by white women continued elsewhere, most notably in Brazil. One remarkable case is that of Roque José Florencio, better known by his nickname Pata Seca. Born around 1827 in Angola, he was brought to Brazil, and because of his extraordinary physique, was made into a breeding slave. According to local records and family memory, he fathered over 200 children. Pata Seca stood roughly 7 feet 2 inches tall, with unusually thin legs, which some believe signaled the potential for strong male offspring. Unlike most enslaved people who labored in the fields or lived in slave quarters, he was housed in the Casa Grande, tasked with tending animals and carrying messages between estates. His value lay entirely in his ability to reproduce. White women within the household oversaw his reproductive role personally, instructing when and with whom he would be paired. Family oral history recounts that he was forced into intimate encounters with multiple women each month. According to one account, his enslavers demanded that he perform on command, regardless of his exhaustion or emotional state. In the eyes of his owners, he was a tool, and that tool was expected to generate more bodies for the plantation. Newspapers and regional documents estimate that Pata Seca became the biological ancestor of nearly 30% of the population in Santa Eudoxia, a town in the state of São Paulo. His forced legacy lived on in faces and bloodlines, though few knew the full cost. Historian Brenda E. Stevenson, in her book Life in Black and White, explains that enslaved men who were selected as breeders were often moved away from their communities, paired with women against their will, and sometimes excused from physical labor to preserve their fertility. Outsiders could think this was a privilege, but it was just another form of slavery, one that took from these men their families, their dignity, and their ability to choose. In many households, white women directed these forced reproductions. Diaries and memoirs, kept by plantation mistresses themselves, reveal that women tracked slave births, encouraged specific pairings, and even swapped partners if pregnancies didn't happen quickly enough. These personal writings, now housed in collections like the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina and the Duke University Archives, show how some white women treated reproduction as part of efficient estate management. Enslaved people were locked in barns or cabins overnight, ordered to have sex with strangers. Refusal meant whippings for both men and women. Even when children were born, fathers had no say. Families were broken up and sold without warning. White women held full authority, especially when husbands were absent or dead. Some, like Martha Gibbs, continued managing enslaved people by force even after slavery ended. They arranged who would sleep with whom, seeking more births to grow their estate. The cruelty ran deep. The same woman who rocked her baby to sleep might send an enslaved man to a stranger's bed that night to produce more children. Reproduction became punishment too. A man who disobeyed could be separated from his partner and reassigned. Mistresses sometimes did this out of pure spite, a reminder that no bond was safe from their control. One case from North Carolina made this terrifying control visible. A white man filed for divorce after learning that his wife had been keeping an enslaved man too near her bed in the night. That quiet phrase, recorded in legal documents, likely meant they were having a sexual relationship. But when rumors started to spread and her reputation came under threat, the woman tried to have the enslaved man sold. Whatever affection had existed didn't matter anymore. She chose her status over him. He went from being her secret partner to a problem she needed to get rid of. This case, uncovered by historian Martha Hodes, is rare only because it left a paper trail. Most relationships like this were erased before anyone could write them down. The man could not testify. He had no legal voice. His story survived only because the scandal briefly entered the public record. An observer from the time, Captain Richard J. Hinton, a Union officer and abolitionist, described a disturbing pattern he witnessed among some white women in the slaveholding South. He noted that certain mistresses would begin by treating an enslaved man with what appeared to be kindness. They might offer small privileges, speak gently, or even shield him from a whipping. But it wasn't generosity, it was strategy. Hinton wrote of one woman who first won the confidence of a man she enslaved, only to later use that trust to pressure him into submission. If he resisted, the soft tone vanished. In its place came threats, punishments, or the reminder that he and everything he loved belonged to her. This emotional manipulation created a chilling kind of control, Enslaved men were caught in a constant guessing game. Was the smile genuine? Was the compliment a trap? Would a simple mistake that morning turn into a violent outburst that night? They had to read every look, every gesture, every shift in tone, not because they were valued, but because their survival depended on it. And no, mistresses who used this tactic weren't simply being erratic. They were calculated. Their goal was to keep enslaved men off balance, to blur the line between affection and authority so thoroughly that obedience became second nature. It was psychological warfare in the home, and for the men targeted by it, there was no safe response. Gratitude could be mistaken for insolence. Distance could provoke suspicion. The only option was to endure, day after day, in silence. And so, for over a century, these stories went untold. The pain endured by black male slaves at the hands of white women remained hidden beneath layers of shame, fear, and silence. It wasn't just that no one wanted to hear it. It was that the world refused to believe it. After slavery ended in 1865, the country began rewriting the story. In the South especially, white women were recast as the noble victims of a lost way of life. The Southern belle became a symbol of purity. Her image, gentle, fragile, morally upright, was used to defend everything from the Confederacy to Jim Crow. That myth could not allow for the truth that some of these women had abused, manipulated, and raped the men they once owned. Black men knew better, but few dared speak. For the men who had survived these hidden abuses, the consequences of telling the truth were too dangerous. To accuse a white woman of anything was to risk death. During Reconstruction, and well into the 20th century, lynching became the preferred method of racial control. A glance, a rumor, a false claim. Any hint of impropriety between a black man and a white woman could be fatal. It was quite ironic. While some white women once coerced or manipulated enslaved men into sexual relationships, the very idea of a black man touching a white woman became a trigger for mob violence after emancipation. The myth of the black male predator, the same lie used to excuse abuse during slavery, was now used to justify public executions. Emmett Till, murdered in 1955 for allegedly whistling at a white woman, was part of a long, unbroken line of victims, punished not for crimes, but for being seen. Meanwhile, the mistresses who had once held absolute power lived out their lives in comfort. They passed down recipes, not confessions. They buried their secrets with their husbands, their ledgers, their letters. And when they were remembered, it was as sweethearts and wives, not as slave owners who orchestrated rape and breeding behind closed doors. But the silence could not last forever. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project began collecting the testimonies of formerly enslaved people. For the first time, survivors spoke into the record, carefully, quietly. Hints emerged of mistresses who took liberties, of women who ordered forced couplings, of strange relationships no one dared explain. The testimonies were guarded, shaped by decades of silence, but the truth was there, buried between the lines. It wasn't until recent decades that historians began to ask different questions, not just about slave owners, but about slave owners' wives, about daughters, about who ran the house when the master was away, and what happened in the rooms where no one else was allowed. Books like White Women, Black Men by Martha Hodes and Rethinking Rufus by Thomas A. Foster opened the door. Scholars returned to the archives, reading court records, divorce filings, bills of sale. They looked again at the letters and journals, and what they found forced a reckoning. White women participated in slavery at every level. They bought and sold human beings. They directed labor. They punished. And some, far more than previously acknowledged, used their position to sexually dominate enslaved men, not just in isolated incidents, but as part of a broader structure of power. Understanding this history matters. It reshapes how we view race, gender, and violence in America. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that victimhood and cruelty are not assigned by sex alone. Women too can be oppressors. Women too can inflict deep harm, especially when society tells them they are incapable of doing so. This is why we tell these stories, to remember the men who were beaten not by the overseer, but by the lady of the house, who were forced to father children on command, who were told yes was expected and no was not an option, who were punished with separation, sold for disobedience, and betrayed by those who claimed to care, who lived with the knowledge that they could be touched, ordered, ruined, and that no one would believe them if they spoke. We tell their story not to shock, but to complete the record. Slavery was not just whips and chains. It was also quiet rooms, soft voices, and the terrible things done when no one was watching. In the end, truth is the only justice left. To say all of their names may be impossible. Most were never written down, but their lives were real. Their pain was real. And now, their story has been heard. Thank you for joining us until the end. If you found this important, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are so many pieces of Black history they tried to erase, and we're here to make sure they're never forgotten. See you in the next one.